In this video, I'm going to show you how I made the animated short film called Chrysalis. I made this film by myself over the course of 3 years by combining real footage that I'd shot with digitally animated characters that I made in 3D. I'll show you how I animated them and how I made their clothes and made other elements in the film and built some fully CGI scenes. I didn't use any AI at all, and this isn't a step-by-step tutorial, but more of a general overview of my creative process, with some insights also from the composer and the sound designer who made the film's audio. I hope that this can be helpful to anyone who's making creative work, so if that sounds like your cup of tea, then settle in and get comfortable. My name is Robin Lochmann. I started working in 3D because it allows me to create anything that I can imagine, really, and I really like the idea of combining that with footage from the real world and seeing where I could blur those lines between what's actually real and what's digital. The project started when I was in France back in 2023. I had a Blackmagic camera with me and I started taking shots off the landscape, just looking for nice compositions. I find that using a camera in the real world is also great practice for composing shots in 3D. It's beautiful down there, just forests and mountains, and I managed to get a bunch of usable material before proper winter settled in. I came back again about 6 months later in the summertime, and I did another round of shooting, this time with the drone, and I chucked all of that into DaVinci Resolve for editing and color correction. I just started organizing everything by what might make sense together, and I did a first pass at matching the colors of the two different cameras and seasons and very different lighting conditions. I didn't have a script at this point, just a visual direction that I wanted to explore, and I knew that I wanted to integrate animated characters into the landscape and that they would be doing this ritual and that there would be a procession. I started collecting images of religious and ceremonial robes and headpieces that had a similar vibe as what I was aiming for. I also wanted to contrast the religious feeling with some leather straps and mix these two otherwise really opposing aesthetics. I love the look of the alchemist character in The Holy Mountain. He has this really iconic silhouette. That and a Catholic bishop's hat, a mitre, were the original inspiration for the main character's head design. I knew that the shape should be somewhat familiar but still unique and have a strong and recognizable profile where the front part is much longer than the back, almost like a shield. I also looked at a bunch of other different religious practices, which was not particularly useful for the project in the end. The first step in creating the characters is to animate the base that you can then later add all of the clothing to. About half of the film is animated by hand in a program called iClone. This was probably the most time-consuming part of the whole project, so about halfway through I got my hands on a Rokoko Smartsuit. This is a motion capture suit that allows you to record body movement that you can then later transfer to any 3D character. It still needs a lot of cleanup work, but at least this is a great base to start from, and it definitely speeds up the process. To make the clothes, I use a program called Marvelous Designer. I started by drawing out the pattern of the clothes in 2D, and I found it helpful here to look at actual tailor patterns for reference, and then you just position the pieces around the character. All of it then needs to be sewn together, and there's this brilliant moment when you run the simulation and all of the fabric just falls into place. And you can still pull it around a bit to make sure that everything fits well. You basically just build it up in separate parts and then you sew them all together until you have a full garment. In some cases I added some top stitching lines, and then you can run the simulation again so that the garment's movement just follows along with the motion of the character's animation. There are a bunch of different fabric types that you can use, like canvas or silk, and they all just drape very differently over the character and give you very different results. The initial inspiration for the dog in the film actually came from the sculpture that I saw in the Louvre in Paris. And I like the idea of a robot animal that's wearing a mask, and the odd and impractical idea of having it on stilts. I don't think that's something that I've seen before. I wanted it to look like it was cobbled together by a bunch of scrap metal and discarded parts that are just barely held together by this rusty frame. I made a rig for it in Cinema 4D so that I could animate it and make it move. I wanted its movements to be janky and feel strenuous, like the rustiness was just holding back that movement a little bit. By this time, it had been months ago since I'd shot that footage in France, and I still had no idea how the characters would look when they're integrated into the real footage. So these are some of the early test shots that I made. None of these shots actually ended up in the film, but it was the first time that I could finally see all of those parts combined, and that felt pretty rewarding. I just started adding characters into some of the shots with a loose idea of how they might all fit together.
I do not use a storyboard. I think it's an instrument of the cowards.
But in fairness, having storyboards would have probably helped me to stay on track a bit more. In earlier versions of the script, there were other characters that I ended up building and then eventually cut out, like this giant baby statue, or this awful kid who ended up just looking like he was part of some Bavarian Antifa, or this mask. Sometimes you just have to spend a while going the wrong way to figure out what the right way is, and that's alright, it's just part of the process. I even finished a couple of scenes with this lad. The inspiration for that actually came from this sculpture. But while I was making this, I went to the cinema to see Dune 2, and there were these characters in it that just looked so similar. It was an odd coincidence, but it did make me decide to just remove that character from the film completely. Roughly half of Chrysalis is made with real background footage, and the other half is fully CG. For these shots, I built the environments in Cinema 4D. This is the main tool that I use to combine all of those 3D elements. I basically just build two main forest sets like this. Once they're finished, I can then move a virtual camera around them freely and frame everything up like you would in the real world. I would always move elements around again later just to get the perfect composition for each shot, and I would often adjust the texture slightly depending on the lighting and the framing of that exact situation. I would usually do a previs first, which is just a really basic render to get the timing of the animation and the camera movement down, and then keep refining it, gradually adding in all of the other details before doing the final render with Octane. I made these 360-degree HDRI images in France that I could use as a starting point to light the scene. This is rarely enough by itself, so I added a couple of extra area lights and made a fog volume, which is basically just a big box of fog that sits on top of the whole scene and breaks up how the light particles shine through it, and it creates this beautiful haze throughout the whole scene. I recommend trying to stay somewhat organized when doing big environment scenes so that when you open up the project again, you don't just completely lose your mind. While working on the film, I didn't have any music to guide me, so I would try to get the timing down just by focusing on the visual rhythm of the film, and I'd often watch back earlier versions of it with different music from different artists, and one artist that I just kept coming back to all the time was Robot Koch.
What drew me to this project was the mood and the feel of the film, and also the spaciousness. I'm often inspired by things that sit just below the surface. That's typically how I work with music too. Like there's a lot of openness, a lot of spaciousness, and a lot of restraint. It's not overdoing anything. It's like really deciding how much is enough. I spent a lot of time with the film before even thinking about music. Then going into an experimentation where I really just sat down and started playing ideas. First on the piano, then finding some synth, and also just playing with sounds and sonics. Working with the vocalists Kate Fleur-Young and Delia de France on this movie was really fun. They understand that I'm using voice often as a color and a texture in music, and they already understood what I needed because I've been working with both of them, and it's been fun to just like work with my friends.
Another key character in the film is this insect or bug. I sculpted this guy in ZBrush. I'm no expert in ZBrush and I don't have a background in sculpting, so to be honest, I'm kind of winging it here, but it's good fun to push and scrape away at it until it takes shape. Once you get up and running with it, it feels almost organic and it's good fun. I then painted it in Substance Painter. It's pretty similar to Photoshop, so you have different layers and masks, and you can paint and mix all of those different materials directly onto a 3D object. It's a really fun way to customize anything, and you can add a lot of extra detail with just the textures. I then made some wings for it, and I added some bones for the legs so that they could bend, and I did some variations of the sculpt for the head so that I could blend between them. And I rigged another joint chain through the center of the head just to make it a bit more wiggly and jiggly. I also animated the wings and added some slight bends to the body And that's it there now in a scene, trapped inside the jar. This actually ended up being one of my favourite shots of the whole film. So all this new AI stuff that was coming out while I was making the film was a pretty big distraction. AI video wasn't really usable when I started to make this film, and I decided to finish the project without using any of it, but it made me think that maybe this is the last time that I would get to do that. I genuinely wonder how CGI will be remembered if AI replaces VFX in films entirely. If every spaceship and monster that's on screen is just based off training data that was made by humans before the age of AI, then maybe CGI will end up having a more precious place in culture or even in art history. For the film's titles, I decided to do something analog. I saw this great talk by Vasilis Marmatakis at Us by Night in Belgium, where he spoke about his poster designs for the Yorgos Lanthimos films and how in some cases he would print out the titles and then wet the paper just to get the edges to be a bit softer. It's very subtle, but it's definitely there if you look closely. It inspired me to try something similar, but to push it a bit further and really let that ink bleed out. So I printed out a bunch of copies of the title and did a really DIY setup to shoot it. I tried different ways of applying water to it, and then also did some variations where I added some India ink just to get some more extreme results. I did a bunch of variations and then chopped together my favorite ones for the final version. When doing something that's creative, it's totally normal to have a certain amount of self-doubt, to not be fully sure of your idea at first, but you just kind of have to test it out and see how it goes, you know? Sometimes it's like this feeling that you have inside you that just needs to find some sort of a release, and if you're worried about what other people might think, then my advice to you would be to just really go for it, you know, and let it out, because you never know, some people might actually really like it and you might make some new connections. Some other shots that were a bit challenging were these ones where I used cloth simulations to tear the cocoon and also the main character's wings. These simulations were done directly inside of Cinema 4D, and in order to control where the cloth breaks, you can paint a vertex map, and that'll allow for the tearing to happen really precisely. I really like how organic that ended up looking. For the scene where the main character emerges from his cocoon, I layered up a variety of different versions so that they would push up from underneath and break at various points. Each layer was reacting to the layer above and below, and they all had different physical properties so that they would all break in slightly different ways. Some other fun shots were these ones where there are these thin white lines that are growing over everything and wrapping around the entire scene. I did this by shooting particles at the object, and the path that the particle has travelled is then traced to form a line, and the particles also split and form new particles. I used the same technique in a couple of different shots in the end where there's this white webbing that covers everything.
The biggest question was how this world would sound. I actually approached it like a live-action film. I muted the soundtrack and filled in every little sound I could see, from the tiniest cloth movements to the footsteps, to the legs of the bug, to even giving a sound to the twitching of the eye of the bug. I tried to make the world as realistic and coherent as possible. In the end, I wanted to do on the audio level what first drew me to the project, which was a clear passion for every little detail. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it seeing it all come together and filling these first silent worlds with life.
The final step in the process is to bring everything back together for compositing and final adjustments in a program called After Effects. Here I can take the shots that I made in 3D and still adjust any element. I can select every object separately and do small adjustments to color or brightness, And I can also add all of the 3D elements to the real footage. The edges here are always a dead giveaway, and you want to aim for things to not look cut out or collaged. So I use the light wrap, which basically just takes light information from the background images and it bleeds it into the edges of the foreground. I'd also add some haze and sometimes more fog and take down some of that digital sharpness and add a little bit of film grain and just generally obsess over every tiny detail that can help to make everything look more balanced. I started making this film because I just loved the process. It was less about the final result and it was more about the act of actually making it. The value isn't only in the end result, but in that devotion to the craft and in showing up for the process again and again, making countless decisions for every detail that forms the final piece. So just stay passionate about what you're making, and if it brings you joy and it brings you meaning, then you're one of the really lucky ones. So just hang in there and enjoy the ride. Good luck.